Hello, and welcome to the Equitable Evaluation course. My name is Yen Chau, and I will be your instructor for this course. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have over 20 years of experience as a thought partner, strategist, inclusive facilitator, and systems thinker. I have partnered with nonprofit organizations, school districts, philanthropic organizations, consulting firms, and even the U.S. Army. My goal is to support individuals and organizations to develop and implement solutions that center on community and with the community, the individuals that are part of the community. We have 5 learning objectives for the course. They are: why should you conduct evaluations about your program, project, or policy? Why would I want to conduct evaluations more equitably? How could evaluations be used to advance equity? What is the life cycle of an evaluation? What are the considerations to advancing equity for each part of an evaluation life cycle? Essentially, we will provide an overview of the different components of an evaluation with an equity lens. The training is split into 2 sections. In the first section, we cover the first 3 questions and offers the foundational principles of implementing an equitable evaluation. In the second section, we dig in and look at each component of the evaluation lifecycle. As we go through the training, you will notice that we will engage with the materials in 2 ways. When you see the pencil, we will pause and practice with the materials at hand. So if you haven't done so, I invite you to jot down or at least note a project that you would like to conduct an evaluation on, or an evaluation in progress in areas that you may want to develop with further. When you see the person, you will listen, review, and reflect. These tend to be spaces where we reflect on our equity practice. Please make sure you have the resource document open throughout the training, as there are hyperlinks to the resources that we will be using for these activities. Without further ado, let's begin. Section 1, Foundational Principles. In this section, we will focus on the intent of evaluations. We will define equity and how equity is advanced using data and evaluations. I love this cartoon by Fresh Spectrum. She says, "Look, as an evaluator, I know you're going to focus on the effectiveness of our program, but our priority is really to just um, show our department head that we're not a total waste of money." Oftentimes, evaluation is seen as something that is punitive for accountability, to seek additional funds, or in this case, return on investment. This may be true, but I want us to think of evaluations as much more than that, or maybe instead of that. So yes, evaluations can be a monitoring mechanism and to describe the implementation of a program, and it could help you articulate and uncover the purpose and assumptions of a program, project, or policy. Sometimes we get so caught up in implementing the program that we forget about the why. Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing this now? Evaluations, of course, help us to gather evidence to what extent our program has had an impact and for whom. Did we reach our intended population? What have been the intended and unintended outcomes of our program? With this evidence, we can also make decisions on what changes, if any, we need to make. If it's not reaching our intended population, then what do we need to change to do so, for example? We might not think of these next 2 purposes of evaluations often, but evaluations can actually help us communicate what is happening in the community or in the broader context. Often we conduct an evaluation as if the program is in a bubble, so that program, if implemented today, would have the exact same impact if implemented 2 years ago. However, we know that COVID-19 had a huge impact on how programs were implemented. So by noting the context of what is happening, it could help us explain why the program may have had different set of outcomes or be implemented differently as intended. Evaluations are usually seen as extractive process. However, we usually don't think of evaluation as part of our community engagement process. It is a way for us to interact with participants, so why wouldn't it be an extension of our program? If done with an equity frame, it could actually empower participants. Okay, let's dig in a little bit. Evaluations can be classified into 2 major categories: formative and summative. Formative provides information to guide program improvement. So did we implement the program as intended? Did we reach the intended population, for example? Summative informs judgment about whether something was effective. How have participants changed as a result of participating? What are the unintended consequences of participation? So here we are with a pencil. Remember at the beginning when I said that when we see a pencil is an opportunity for us to pause and practice? At this point, pause the training and take a few minutes to reflect and jot down your thoughts on the following questions. What is or are the purposes of your evaluation? What are you trying to accomplish? What would you be able to do to know and or do with the results of your evaluation that you currently cannot? Or maybe do better, less, or even differently? And how can evaluation help? So again, please feel free to pause the training and press play when you're ready to resume. We're now at the second question of the first section of our training. Here we focus on why we want to conduct evaluations more equitably. But before we do that, we need to define what we mean by equitable evaluations. For that, we're going to watch a short clip featuring Abigail Echo Hawk, Executive Director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. Listen from the 8-minute and 20-second mark to the 14-minute and 54-minute mark. Once you're done listening, take a few minutes to answer the following questions. How did the short clip challenge how you define equity, and how did it make you feel? To find the link to the short clip, go to your Equitable Evaluation course resources. It's the first resource on that sheet. In short of what was offered by Abigail Echo Hawk, equity is both a means and an end. As summarized by the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, an offer from the Change Elemental, deep equity means working towards outcomes in ways that model dignity, justice, and love without recreating harm in our structures, strategies, and working relationships. This is the how. How do we show up in partnership with others? From the World Health Organization, equity is the absence or remedial differences among groups or people, whether those groups are denied socially, economically, demographically, or geographically. That is the what. How does our program, project, and our policy remove these differences? When we focus on the what, the outcomes, but we forget that the ways in which we obtain those outcomes are just as important. There are too many lessons in history where we've created harm because of the ways in which we carry out a program. The infamous Tuskegee syphilis study to find a cure for syphilis, researchers did not provide any effective care. The so-called treatments were extremely harmful and even caused death. Additionally, the researchers broke the trust with participants and caused such a distress in public health from Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. Although this is an extreme case, it is an example of how, in a search for a cure, we didn't consider how we approach that cure. And as a result, to this day, many communities, many BIPOC communities, are still very skeptical of public health. So keep this in mind as we look at a typical evaluation design. So this is a pretty standard one. Look at how standards for the design is in the center, right? Utility, feasibility, propriety, accuracy. And then different components of the evaluation is around those standards, right? So engaging stakeholders, describe the program, focus evaluation design, gather credible evidence, justify conclusions, use and share lessons learned. As you look at that typical evaluation design, there's nothing wrong with it. And our definition of equity as a means and as an end. Take a moment to pause and reflect and note your thoughts on the following questions. What are the potential inequities in a typical evaluation design? Where may the process feel extractive for participants? And what are the potential places where harm or indifference towards participants may be inadvertently caused? Where are the potential inequities in your evaluation design? So pause the training, and once you're done, press play again. So then how do we go from a typical evaluation design to one where community and the participants are at the center? But before we dig into how we do it, let's briefly chat about why. Why would we want to incorporate a more equitable design into our evaluation? Here are some reasons. Incorporating a more equitable design allows us to center on the needs, perspectives, and assets of different groups, and not just our own. It allows us to understand the context of the individuals and the program, their knowledge, the processes, and the practice. It centers on relationships and engagement between all the individuals that are involved, the evaluator, the program individuals, and the participant, and not just the program. It allows us to raise and align to the questions that the community may have, and not just our own. And because of all of this, our evaluation engagement could actually empower the community. It signals to them that we care and respect them, and we respect their thoughts and ideas. So then, the evaluation is for the people and by the people, and not just for the funder, for accountability purposes, or even the program implementers. Okay, so we've come to the end of section 1. Let's remind ourselves of our 3 objectives. The first objective we were hoping to explore is why should you conduct evaluations about your program, project, or policy? The next objective that we were exploring is why would you want to conduct evaluations more equitably? And then finally, how could evaluations be used to advance equity? So take a moment to jot down your thoughts to these questions, and I hope you come back to these thoughts as you conduct your evaluation. And to further support the first section and your practice in the foundations of equitable evaluation and evaluation practice, here are some additional resources. Again, these resources can be found in the separate resource document that is associated with this course. All right, welcome back to the equitable evaluation course. We are now at section 2. In the first section, we focus on the foundational principles of evaluation. But in this section, we get to more of the nuts and bolts of conducting an evaluation. We will walk through the evaluation life cycle and how we center on community throughout the life cycle. So the evaluation life cycle consists of program design and implementation, evaluation design, gathering evidence, developing those insights, and how to use and share those insights with community. And as we go through this second part of the course, we were trying to shift away from a more typical evaluation design that is illustrated with this graphic to one where the evaluation is for the people and by the people. So to help us do that, let's review Chicago's Beyond Guide on Research and the 7 Inequities. The title of the guide is Why Am I Always Being Researched? A guidebook for community organizations, researchers, and funders to help us get from insufficient understanding to a more authentic truth. So the 7 inequities that Chicago's Beyond developed include access, information, validity, ownership, value, accountability, and finally authorship. I highly suggest you review the entire guide, but for this course, we'll focus on just pages 20 to 27, where each of those inequities are defined by Chicago Beyond. After you review the guide, reflect on the following questions. What are you sitting with after the review? What resonated with you? What will you consider as you develop your own evaluation? And as a reminder, the resource can be offered from the Equitable Evaluation Course Resources document. It's the first resource under evaluation, section 2, evaluation life cycle. All right, so now that we have some framing and foundations on why and how we want to conduct our evaluation with a much more equitable lens, we're going to go through each of the components of the life cycle. I'll offer some guidance, considerations, and exercise for each of those components. So let's first start with program design and implementation. Here we'll focus on strategy versus program versus policy evaluation. And then we'll actually get to develop, or at least start developing your logic model. So what is the difference between a strategy versus program versus a policy evaluation? So a program project could be a single intervention. A policy is a set of ideas or plans on what to do in particular situations that has been agreed to officially by a group of people, an organization, a government, or a political party. This policy could be small p, like an organizational HR policy, or big P, like food safety policy. A strategy then is a coordinated set of programs, policies, and policies if relevant. So as we walk through the life cycle, we need to be mindful of what it is that you're trying to evaluate, because depending on what you're trying to evaluate, it could add complexity, right? A program project evaluation is much easier than one that involves a strategy, which has many more components to it. So before you decide on your evaluation design and questions, you need to be clear, like, what is it? Are we evaluating a simple or a single intervention, such as a program or project? Or are we really evaluating a whole host of projects and programs, and thus a strategy evaluation? Now, this is your standard logic model, and it has different falling components to it. And we'll walk through the components in just a little bit. But I want to caveat some things about a logic model. Logic model. I don't love the logic model because it makes everything seems simple and one directional. However, we know that in the real world that doesn't necessarily happen, right? I mean, we don't just do one thing and expect this particular outcome. We wish that was the case, but we know that there's other factors that influence the impact of our particular program. However, having a logic model or a theory of change, if you're planning to evaluate policy or strategy, is super helpful for your evaluation because it helps you to articulate the different components, the context and assumptions of your program, policy, or strategy. It makes your thinking visible, and thus it helps to assure that we're all on the same page, right? So it gives you a visual representation of what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're hoping to achieve. So now let's actually walk through the different components of a logic model. Right? So the idea is to articulate as much as you know and to center our equity practice. This isn't an exercise for you to do sitting at your desk alone. You would want to gather input, conduct some sense making with different stakeholders, including partners and participants, and have them help you develop this logic model together. But for the sake of this exercise, we're going to probably do it on our own sitting at our desk. So the first component of a logic model is your inputs, and these are the resources that the organization or program uses, such as people, materials, funding to implement your program. The next component is your activities, and these are the components of the program, right? So the different things that you plan to do in your program. Then there's the output. This is what we count, such as people reached, products created, and the number of activities implemented. The next thing is your outcomes, right? This is what we hope to achieve. So if we do these different activities and we reach this many level of people, then this is the outcome that we hope to achieve. Now, the impact is your intended or unintended long-term change. So whereas the outcomes is more of your short-term impact, the long-term is articulated in the impact section, right? So these are changes to institutions, community, organizations, or even policy. Finally, context and assumptions. These are factors, internal, external to the program, that influence what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the potential impact it have on your program. Right? So, like I said earlier, right, your program doesn't exist in a bubble, and so actually putting down on paper some of the concepts and assumptions about your program helps you think about the ways in which your program is actually being operationalized in the community. And if like things don't work out as the way you intended, well, you can look for the context and assumptions and see whether there was something there that impacted the outcomes. Okay, so let's look at a sample of the information for each of the component of a logic model, right? For in this sample, it is one for a youth leadership program that incorporates aspects of connecting with the natural environment. So a couple of inputs was funding from a particular funder, right? And the fact that there is a quarter-time FTE, so full-time employee, dedicated to to this particular program. In addition to the quarter time person, There is at least 2 staff members or and partners who are dedicated to each of the particular sessions, right? Some of the activities include like partner coordinated activities, some youth journaling, some hands-on service projects, and some youth to youth kind of connections, right? And some of the outputs that we've already are planning to collect is like the number of volunteer service hours that both the youth are providing to the community as well as the partners. How many youth are enrolled in the program and their attendance, right? Do we have high attendance or low attendance? And also the attendance of the partners and how they're being engaged in the youth sessions. So a couple of the outcomes in the short term that this project was particularly interested in is, to what extent did it spark curiosity for the natural environment amongst the youth that participated, and also whether or not it supported youth's social and emotional development, right? But in the long term, the program hope that with this opportunity, the youth actually stay and remain active in their community, right? This is a small mountain town, so instead of moving to a more urban area, the idea was that in participating in this program and making the connections, that the youth would actually be incentivized and want to stay in this small town. A couple of context assumptions to know was that this program was actually created during COVID-19, but the program was actually implemented once COVID-19 restrictions were lifted, but when the inflation was really high. So what they were mindful about the implications for travel, price of gas was really high, and how much in-person engagement was needed, or was it, too little, given that this was, again, when, right after COVID-19 restrictions were lifted. Right, so in a second, we'll do a quick little exercise to get you started on thinking about your own logic model. But before we go there, I just wanted to offer a few considerations for you to think through. Again, it's not something you want to do on your own. I mean, how can you use a logic model to invite conversation and shared understanding with participants and partners? So how was the program and thus a logic model designed with the participants? We want to reflect on the arc. So the program shifts over time so that what you do now may not be what you do later. So how do you convey that in your logic model? Again, right, like in the youth program one, we know it was important for us to note that, of the implications potentially of COVID-19. Context matters. So what needs to be the same or different to represent, especially if this is a strategy. So if you're planning to or if this is a program that's implemented in a variety of settings, then noting like, what is the difference or what's similar in those contexts so that it could to inform, right, the impact and the differences in the impact. Simplicity is best, and noting the nuance is worthy. Like I said, I do have a love and hate relationship with Logic Model. It is a nice, simple graphic representation. You may get tempted to know all the things in relationships, but it will then feel overwhelming. But if it's too simple, you're leaving out the nuance. So decide on the key components and key aspects that you want to make sure you're conveying, but leaving some of the narrative like off to the side. So actually, with a lot of times when I have a logic model, I have a narrative that goes with it. And finally, it doesn't need to be perfect. You don't want the desire for perfection to paralyze you. There may be spaces where there are questions or uncertainties, and that's okay. Note that. You want to make sense when you look at it right and left, that it makes sense. So, when you're looking at a logic model, can you track the connections and relationships between, what you're saying is a long-term outcome from the input, and whether the input will lead to those long-term outcomes, and there's not like a whole lot of magic thinking that's happening. All right, so like I said earlier, this is now your chance to, jot down some thinking around your logic model. So take a moment to jot down a few things about your program, strategy, or policy into a logic model. I know I said you shouldn't do this on your own, but this is just an opportunity to put something down to play with your logic model. So where are the places where you're clear, and where are the places where you're not so clear, right? So at this point, pause the course. Again, jot down some thinking around your logic model, and once you have put down some thoughts, then continue with the course. All right, now that you have your logic model in hand, let's go to a different part of the evaluation life cycle, the evaluation design. Here, we're going to really focus on the types of evaluation questions. There are typically two types of evaluation questions: formative, um, meaning examining the progress or your progress of your program, and then there's summative, right? So things that you kind of do at the end to look at the impact. Here we've mapped the questions to the different parts of the logic model. So your summative evaluation questions typically pertain to the outcomes and the impact of your logic model. And like I said, the formative questions, are really both documenting and assessing your resources, inputs, your activities, as well as your outputs. So in short, your formative questions provide information to guide your program implementation and improvement, and your summative offers judgment about whether something was effective. So here we offer some examples of formative and summative questions, and offering you a chance to just see them a little bit deeper. So when we think about process questions, this is like, are we doing what we intended, right? So are we assessing the program as implemented, as planned? And progress evaluation then is, are we assessing the progress towards meeting the outcomes? Like, what are the indicators to tell us that we're actually making progress towards those outcomes? And then there's summative, right? So to assess what did the program actually achieve and whether it actually achieved its intended goals, right? So did we have any impact on the attitudes, behaviors, knowledge, skills, status, and level of functioning? And what, if any, did our program make on a particular organization, or community, or a system? So here I provide more specific examples and map those questions to the logic model that we created for the youth leadership program. So for the formative questions, evaluation questions, for example, we ask like, how many sessions have we hosted, right? So, have we hosted the number of sessions that we intended to by this time? What is our attendance like at some of these sessions? I mean, do we have a high attendance? Do we have a low attendance? And what are some of the things that are preventing a high attendance if we find out that we have very low attendance? And how are youth receiving the session? So like, what are youth thinking about the program? Is it moving towards sparking that curiosity for the natural environment, for example? So once, we have those questions in place, and when we look at our summative, right, questions, we can ask ourselves, to what extent are youth more curious about their natural environment? And of course, we would have defined what we mean by curious, right? So that some of those indicators would have been answered in our formative questions. To what extent and how have we youth felt a sense of belonging? Again, right, because some of the longer term outcomes is like we hope they will stay and remain active in our community. So just like with the logic model, as you develop your evaluation questions, here are some things to consider, right? Some things to keep in mind. So how do my questions map to my logic model? Like, what do I need to know? What do I need to know when? Who needs to know it? And why do I need to know it? So again, like we want to think about our evaluation questions and making sure that they're represented in the logic model and vice versa. Accountability. How will participants inform or drive my questions? Again, this centers on relationships and our equity practice so that we're asking questions that have been informed by others, and particularly the participants. Confirming or exploring. What do I already know? So, let's try not to ask questions that you already know the answer to, or what needs to be changed about our question, so that we're really answering what you need to know and not just what you want to know. And finally, context matters. So if you have multiple sites or different types of participants, then context really matters here. So what needs to change about your question to account for the differences in the context? I mean, maybe some of your questions are really about the different phases of the program. If you have multiple programs going on, then some of your indicators may look differently if the program was just starting versus something that has been in place for quite some time. Alrighty, so similar to what we did for your logic model, let's just take a few minutes for you to begin drafting some of your evaluation questions. Just for good practice, let's draft at least one question for process, one question for progress, and one for summative. Okay, so take a moment, pause the course now. And again, just take a moment to draft a process, a progress, and a summative evaluation question. Now that we have our logic model and our evaluation question, let's start gathering evidence. For this section, we'll focus on different types of data and what do we mean by reliability and validity. Broadly speaking, there are two types of data: quantitative, qualitative, and storytelling. Quantitative data includes your numerical data, like a Likert or rating scale surveys or tests, for example, if you could rate something between 1 and 5, that's what we're talking about when talking about numerical data. Quantitative data relies on statistical procedures. It's relatively easy to collect and is often used for large, populations. Your qualitative data is your non-numerical data and could include interviews, focus groups, observations, or document reviews. Open-ended questions and surveys are also considered qualitative data. With qualitative data, you're looking for themes, patterns to help you make sense of the data, right? And because it is more time consuming, it is often used with smaller groups or a subset of a larger population. Then there's storytelling. I don't consider storytelling a type of data because you can use both quantitative and qualitative data as part of your storytelling efforts. It could also include a variety of art forms. But the purpose of storytelling is to build or share a narrative. It could focus on an individual, a group, or even a context or an issue. So when we talk about data, we have to touch upon the concepts of reliability and validity. Reliability is when a measurement is stable and the results are obtained after repeating the same process several times. There's internal validity, so the ability to draw a causal link between your program and your outcome, and external validity, the ability to generalize your findings to other populations. Then there is validity, which is the accuracy of the measurement. There's retest reliability, as a measure of how consistent or stable a measurement instrument is over time. And inter-rater reliability is when the answers are produced regardless of the test or instrument used. Unfortunately, reliability and validity have been used to perpetuate inequities because they're used to ensure that instruments or findings are the same over time and over populations. However, we have said many times before, context matters. And so we want to hold these concepts lightly and explore how they can be helpful as well as how they can be harmful to your analysis. So let's go back to our youth development program. Given our logic model, here are some data sources that will help us explore our logic model and obviously our evaluation questions as well. So youth attendance can be obtained through sign-in sheets. Youth curiosity of the natural environment can be assessed using several sources of information. For example, the applications that youth use to apply for the program can give us a baseline understanding of their natural environment. There are also small group huddles where we can listen for whether and how the natural environment is being discussed. So that's a qualitative source. Youth are also required to present a service project at the end, which is really an opportunity for storytelling, for example. So you can see how multiple data sources can be used to support our understanding of one particular outcome. So then as you consider your data collection efforts, here's some things to think about. Right? Data is simply knowledge and information, and thus it could come from a variety of sources, informally or formally. Like we talked about in the youth program, like what are we listening for during youth circle time, for example. And thus, before you collect more data, take an inventory of where there's already knowledge and information shared or collected. Like I said, there's, informing group huddles is an opportunity for you to listen to how your program have influenced the participants. So you don't necessarily need then to hold a focus group, but you can incorporate, what you're listening for in the small group huddle. Before you collect any data, have a data collection and sense-making plan. And this will help you realize where knowledge and information may already be shared and collected and thus leveraged for your evaluation. And context matters. It matters not only for when the program is happening, but also for the evaluation and when the evaluation and data and sense making is happening. Different types of data collection efforts may resonate with some community members more than others. The time of year or even the time of day may impact how individuals respond to your questions. So, how often we blame poor evaluation data on the questions that we're asking, but many times it's not the questions, but the ways in which we're asking the question and whether we understand the context and have the relationships with the individuals. So, one way to have better understanding and to develop relationship is ensuring that our evaluation efforts promote language justice. So, please review page 4 from the Communities Creating Health Environments Language Justice Toolkit. Once you review the page, take a moment to jot down your thoughts to the following question. What are the considerations in promoting language justice and language access when collecting data? A reminder that you can access a resource through the resource document. It is the second link under section 2, evaluation lifecycle. Okay, so now let's help you build your data collection plan. Here are a few questions to help you get started. Based on your logic model, your evaluation questions that you drafted before, what are the data sources of information that you already have access to? How would you answer them using quantitative, qualitative, and/or storytelling? And what approach would you use? And what different types of data tell you about your program or policy? So as you draft these questions and draft your data collection plan, don't forget about the Communities Creating Healthy Environments Language Justice Toolkit. So at this point, again, take a moment, pause the course, and jot down some thoughts on your data collection plan. And here are some additional resources for this part of the training that we have just discussed. All right, so we're going to combine the last two components of the evaluation lifecycle, develop insights and use and share insights. Here we'll delve into data disaggregation, asset-based, and participatory sense-making. The reason why I combine these two last components of the evaluation lifecycle is sometimes as you're developing the insights, you're actually also using and sharing those insights at the same time. They also have similar community engagement components too. And so that's why I like to discuss them together instead of separately. So to kick us off, let's continue listening to our earlier webinar featuring Abigail Echo Hawk, the Executive Director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. Please start listening at the 24 minute and 50-second minute mark to the 55 minute mark. The webinar continues to share how structural racism is perpetuated through data and offers consideration in advancing data equity. After you listen to this section, take a few minutes to jot down your own reflections to the following questions. What are you sitting with when you're listening to this webinar? What resonated with you? And what will you consider as you develop and share and use insights from your evaluation? All right, now that we've listened to Abigail Echo Hark, I also want you to review the Health Affairs article, Disaggregating Race Ethnicity Data Categories, the Criticism, Dangers, and Opposing Viewpoints. Once you have the opportunity to review the article, I want you to jot down your reflections to the following questions. What are you sitting with after reviewing this article? What resonated with you? And what did this raise for you and your own experience with data disaggregation? So as was discussed in the article, right, data disaggregating allows you to understand context and nuance on what is happening in the outcome of your program. It also elevates the different perspectives and life experiences of your participants. So if you're planning on disaggregating your data, though, here are some things to keep in mind. like the article shared, because there has been some criticisms as well as dangers of data disaggregation. So, how are your participants informing the categories you're using to disaggregate on, and how are they informing how the data will be used? How are how are you protecting the participants from harm, right? So not only how will you de-identify the data, but also how will you ensure that the data doesn't create or perpetuate harmful negatives? People's experiences and their perceptions of those experiences could greatly vary. However, so often when we interpret the data, we think that there could only be one story or set of narratives that surfaces. Instead, how will you explore the data to allow for multiple truths to surface and be shared? All right, so now let's try to draft your data disaggregation plan. Here are some questions to help you get started. And as you draft your plan, think about the webinar on data genocide and the unintended consequence as a result of data disaggregation. How will you disaggregate your data? Or which identities will you use? What are your current policies and processes for disaggregating data? What additional training for staff, infrastructure, processes, etc. may be necessary so that you can disaggregate data? And how will you ensure that even small sample sizes have voice and participants are not harmed? So again, take a moment, pause this course. Once you have jotted down some thoughts, then we will continue with the course. All right, let's continue with a little bit more about sense making. I want you to watch this very short video from Travian Shorters, who will describe asset framing and how it is part of an equity practice. So shifting from a deficit frame to one that centers on individuals or communities' assets shifts us away from statistics, disparities, focusing on the challenges, problems, situations, and focuses on the humans, the humanity, right? It really, as Travian Shorter said, it really focuses on the promises, the inspirations that an individual has, and not just on their on the challenges. So we want to focus what is possible and on the individual's growth, and shifts away from blaming the individuals to calling out the individual and to calling out the institutions and systems, and not on blaming the individual. Related to our disaggregation conversation from earlier, it shifts away from using white individuals as a comparison group. That mindset shifts our orientation that we need to compare ourselves to white individuals. Instead, it focuses on that individual's growth and their own change. So let's practice this a little bit. For this next exercise, grab a report, a survey, or something that you've recently written and check the frame, the language that you're using. Did you use person first language? For example, do you say a person experiencing homelessness or a homeless individual? Do you use terms like at risk or vulnerable? If so, how would you change the language so it focuses on the individual's aspirations? Right? What do they hope to achieve? What or who is your default comparison group? Are you looking at changes within individuals? Are you comparing them to another group? And do you offer solutions and the source of the problem? Right? So what solutions at the systems level are you offering? And who are the solutions to problems focused on? Are you focusing the problems and the solutions on the individual? Okay? So take a second and just grab a report or something that you've written recently and look at the ways in which you have used the language in the framing. Is it with a much more asset-based frame or with a deficit frame? So we focus a lot of our conversation on the last components of the evaluation life cycle, on developing insights. Let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about sharing those insights. I love this cartoon, once again by Fresh Spectrum. Here it is depicted that they do everything in the evaluation process, except for sharing the report and is posting. So, it makes you also wonder, right? Is posting a report on your website or social media really sharing the findings? So let's talk about a more participatory process. What do we mean by participatory sense making? Or so participatory data sense making is also a way for you to um, share those insights, right? But it allows participants to get to know and engage with each other and not just with the data. So part of it is to create community or to continue to support a sense of community. It allows participants to bring in important context to the data that may explain the results, as well as offer nuance and depth to it. Evaluators tend to be outsiders to the program, the community, and so having the community wrestle with the data allows context to be surfaced that the evaluator may not be able to know and recognize. When participants engage in the data, they are more likely to understand and use it. We may not realize all the use of the data, and so this process could spark ideas and thinking from participants that we didn't even anticipate. And co-creating the insights and potentially how to use and share those insights as well. Right? So how would we go about conducting a participatory data sense making process? Here are some general steps. Step one, of course, we need to gather the data, whether that be quantitative, qualitative, and or stories. Step two, right, we conduct preliminary analysis and offers, the data based on, questions of interest to all the stakeholders that will be involved in sense making, right? And these, stakeholders could be the participants, program developer, and the evaluator. So we don't want to just present raw data because that might be really overwhelming to some folks, right? They're not sure how to make sense of it, especially participants who may not be used to looking at raw data. But we also don't want to analyze it a bunch and make full conclusions either. So all we're doing is just, we don't want to like present the findings and then ask people if that resonates with them, but instead offer them an opportunity to wrestle with that information themselves and do their own sense making. So then finally, in step three, we want to schedule opportunities for conversations with participants that are accessible and meaningful. This isn't about checking it off of our to-do list. As we think about this step, just a reminder of our language justice toolkit. What do we need to do and to consider to make sure that it is accessible and meaningful to everyone? So here are just a few possible tools on how to facilitate a more participatory sense-making session. You could actually combine a couple of these so they're not like mutually exclusive. For instance, you could use a data placemat or a dashboard, for example. So creating one of those to depict the data that has been collected, and then using a data gallery walk, for example, to help participants actually explore the different stations of the data placemat. Um, And the thing to keep in mind is that as you think about each of these tools, is what is the conversation that you want to have, right? So before you decide on the tool, think about, okay, so this is the purpose of the conversations, and then pick the tool that best serves that purpose. COVID-19 has taught us that in person is great, but if that's not possible, either for logistics purposes and also to expand access, as well, there are plenty of online tools that can help us host these conversations. So here are a few options, and all of them does have a free version, although the free version for some of these tools could be limited, especially for large groups. You definitely want to try them out and figure out which one works for you. And again, to emphasize, right, is like before you decide on the tool that you want to use, is to think about the conversation that you want to have. So another great cartoon by Fresh Spectrum. As you think about sharing findings in any platform, written and or verbal, we just need to be mindful of the words that we use and how we use them. So often we review findings, especially in written format, that there's just so much jargon that it's hard to understand what the report is saying. So going back to the language justice toolkit is to ensuring that the language and the ways in which we present and share findings is culturally sensitive. Alrighty then, let's get started in drafting your participatory sense-making plan. Here are some questions that you can use to help guide you. So to just take a few minutes again to jot down some of your thoughts. What are the questions that you'll explore during your sense-making session, and how do they map to your logic model? Again, these are your evaluation questions, so you want to make sure that you're mapping your logic model and your data sense-making plan are connected. Who will you invite? How will participation benefit the participants? Again, consider the different participants, and so there may be different benefits, right? Stipends can be offered, but what other resources can you offer, such as your time? When and how will it occur? Again, keeping in mind language justice, right? How will you share the data? So will you share it beforehand? Will you share it online, in person, written, verbal, etc.? Just a few things to consider. And how will you create a sense of belonging for the participants? So how are you mindful about the power dynamics and the familiarity of the project and data with the different types of participants that will be part of your sense making? How will you host the conversation? So we just offered you a couple of possible platforms to use, but what facilitation techniques will you use? And again, the tools that you use should be dependent on the conversations that you want to have. So take a moment to pause this course and to jot down a few thoughts that you have on your participatory sense-making plan. So here are some additional resources that we've used from the session, and I offer just a few more because there are some really great resources, for this particular part of the training. So I just highly encourage you to revisit or visit the resource document and review some of these additional resources. Okay, so before we conclude this training, I just want to offer a couple more words. This training focused on the evaluation itself. However, the practice of equitable evaluation really begins with you, the evaluator. Understanding your worldview, unlearning practices that perpetuate inequities. What you're doing is trying to undo and unlearn mindsets, behaviors, and practices that are beyond us and have been entrenched for a very long time. However, each one of us can take a small and necessary step to advancing equity, and not just the outcomes, but how we show up as human beings and how we show up and care for one another. So I'm offering two additional resources I hope will help you be a much more equitable evaluator. With that, let's review our intended objectives for this course. So in section 1, we touched upon the foundational principles of evaluation and, and the how and why we may want to conduct evaluations more equitably. We share how evaluations can actually create and perpetuate harm if we're not mindful of it. In section 2, we walk through an evaluation life cycle, one that centers on community, evaluation for the people and by the people. We walk through the 6 components: program design and implementation, where we drafted our logic model. In evaluation design, we crafted our evaluation questions. We discussed different types of data and storytelling for gathering evidence. For develop insights and use and share insights, we delved into disaggregating data, how to asset instead of deficit frame, and how to conduct a sense-making session that is much more participatory and not so extractive. Again, my name is Yen, and I just wanted to thank you for taking this course with me. I hope this course was helpful as you explore your equitable evaluation practice. And please don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions and thought about this course. Thank you.